Okay, now we're good.
I'd like to call the meeting of the Village of Ashwaubenon Finance and Personnel Committee to order. Call to order, roll call.
Tom Selk,
Here.
Tracy Fluke,
Here.
Allison Burnett.
Here.
Anybody online? No, I guess that's it. Allison Williams and Chris Zerbel are excused.
Okay, pledge of allegiance, please. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Action on the agenda. Any additions or corrections?
Motion to approve the agenda.
Second. Motion and second to approve the agenda. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Action on minutes. I have a couple of questions, excuse me, on the minutes. That just as an update, what has happened? Is everyone now on the insurance plan that was suggested as of 2021?
Yes, I believe the question is, has everyone converted from the PPO option to an HSA plan? And yes, everyone has been transferred over to an HSA program.
And Greg, what's the update on the audit services, if there is any?
We have transitioned to the new audit provider, Baker Tilly, and I'm in the middle of doing the audit. The preliminary is kind of done, but then the final is coming up, so there's a lot of prep work to get that ready.
Okay, thank you. Motion to approve the minutes?
So move.
Second?
Second.
Motion to approve the minutes, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carried. Comments from the public? Seeing none, we'll move on to action items. Action on repayment agreements. That Brian?
Yeah, so I brought these agreements forward for you guys to take a look at. We can discuss. The primary purpose of this is to help the village recoup some of the costs that are incurred in training, hiring, that type of stuff of new employees. And if they decide that at some point they want to terminate their employment with us, or perhaps if we have an issue with them, either between 3 or 5 years, this pre-employment agreement would take effect. And what brought about this was we had a recent employee who we sent through the law enforcement academy. Had started his FTO program, was not, I don't even know if he was halfway through the FTO program, and decided that this law enforcement part of our duties was not for him. And he resigned immediately, didn't even give us a 2-week notice. So that prompted me thinking, well, the village just expended a whole lot of money on this young man, and he decided that this wasn't for him, and so we're out that money. Now, Allison had asked a question on how many people this affected over the last 5 years, I think it was. And that was, I have to look at my notes, but that would have affected maybe 4 people, I think, something like that. Let me just verify that so I don't misspeak.
You had shared 3 with me, 3 between 2017 and this year, that had this agreement been in place prior to their employment, they would have had the repayment.
Actually, it looks like I blocked out the names, but there were 2 in 2017, 1 in 2020, and 1 in, well, just recently in 2021.
And 2 were terminated, 2 resigned of their own will.
Correct, yep. So one of our challenges with our department is with doing all 3 disciplines is we have to send people to 2 trainings most of the time. One is a law enforcement academy if they don't already have that certification, and the other one is the firefighting and EMS. So that actually, the firefighting is a 6-month training that they have to go through, Part A, Part B, and then Firefighter 1. So that's quite expensive in and of itself. If it was possible, if it is possible for us to hire someone that has all of the training, we would love to have that. That's very rare, however. We have had it at least once since I've been here, which is a year, which is great. But that's one of the things that we would love to see. The difference between the 3 and 5 year contracts, the 3-year contract is for someone that we do not have to put through an academy or training, that they already have it. The 5-year is if we do. If we have to put them through one of the trainings or both or whatever it might be, that amount is a little bit more. And so that's the difference between the 3 and the 5-year contract. This is not governed by the union. This is a pre-employment contract, so they don't have any say in that regard. And the dollar amounts really are a fraction of what we actually expend on them, depending on when they leave or are terminated, just in salary alone. That's not to mention, you know, the uniforms, our time, that type of stuff as well. So happy to answer any questions you have on that. But I thought this might be a viable option for the village for these limited circumstances where we end employment before 3 and 5 years, whether it's on their own or perhaps they are making it as an officer.
What are other municipalities doing? Something similar to this?
Some do, some don't. It just kind of, it's up to the individual municipality. I will say in my previous employment, we had this in place.
Brian, in the agreement, it says if applicant terminates employment for any reason within 3 years. Will that cover if the Village of Ashwaubenon also terminates their employment? I know you said that at the beginning, but does that verbiage make that clear that also we're saying, and maybe we're not saying that, but if the village terminates someone, then this also goes into play?
Yes.
Okay.
And this was drawn up by an attorney.
Okay.
We haven't had any issues. I haven't had any issues with it in the past.
Okay.
I have a lot of thoughts on this. I know you
Well,
guys
well,
are
share them
probably
with
all,
us.
you probably all thought it's going to be a short meeting, only 2 items. No. So I struggle with this, and I really appreciate your responses to my questions, and I can appreciate and respect the challenges of hiring for such a unique department structure. You know, we are the only one in our region, so it's virtually highly unlikely, if not impossible, to recruit or attract talent from neighboring regional departments, because that individual would be lacking in at least one area, just because so many other departments have this sort of isolated approach where you have your separate fire department, separate police department. But I really feel that this is a stick rather than a carrot, and I think it's a little bit, frankly, out of touch with what younger people are expecting in workplaces. I would never sign a 5-year contract like this. Now, granted, I'm in a very different field, but I just think that people's career tracks are so mobile nowadays, and that's just a reality that is a cost of doing business for every single human resource department and organization, governmental or not. I wish there was a way to approach this more like a carrot, like a tuition reimbursement agreement. Some organizations, if you've incurred debt in student loans, let's say, to attain your minimum educational needs for that role, if you work there a certain amount of time, they'll provide a grant on the back end after year 3 or year 5 to help reimburse some of those costs or pay off some of that debt, especially knowing that you'd be incurring interest on those loans. What really got me is the idea that if somebody really feels this role isn't for them, let's say that the expenditure was $8,000, that could very well mean that their last 2 to 3 entire paychecks would be going back to the village, which would mean they're honestly kind of working in a sort of indentured servant type role, even though they signed on to it. It's just something that I think people would sign but not really think through the ramifications of. The other thing is, as a taxpayer in Ashwaubenon, I certainly don't want people in our public safety department working there to avoid repaying a contract longer than they want to if they are not invested in that role. I just think that that is going to lend itself to a really unhealthy departmental dynamic where you have people that can do the job, don't really want to do the job, and now have a vested financial interest to stay in a job that they are not wanting to be in. So I guess my 2 potential solutions, because I see that this is still a problem, would be exploring an option that's like that reimbursement agreement where And I guess my big question with that would be, are academy trainings of this nature, the type of training that an individual could take out a student loan for? And the other would be, how can we be more upfront with people about the realities of these roles in the interview process? I'm not suggesting that your department or the human resource efforts are hiding anything, but I just wish there was a way to have sort of on-the-job shadowing type interview experience so that people have a greater sense of what this job actually entails. Because it does sound like there's a disconnect with some of these recent hires where they sign on, they do the training, they're obviously excited enough to start here and let the village invest in them, but then once they hit a certain level in that training or in their employment, they're like, whoa, 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 this isn't what I thought I signed up for. How can we better approach that on the front end so people do have that sense?
So I'm going to answer that last question or that last thought with the last subject that went through. He applied to our agency 3 times before he got hired. He went on several ride-alongs. He went through the academy. He got all that, experience, that prior knowledge ahead of time. I don't know what else we could have done to provide the information to him on what our job is about. He saw all of that, during his ride-alongs, his time, his application, all that stuff, and in the academy. Granted, the scenarios in the academy aren't exactly like real life, but they're somewhat simulated to that. So from our perspective, and I even asked him that, what could I have done or we have done as an agency to better prepare you for what you're going to see on the street? And he wasn't sure either, other than, maybe something in the academy, but they're kind of limited in that regard as well. So from our end, I'm not really sure what else we could have done on our part.
Can I just ask a real quick question before you go? So, sorry, I got here late, mixture work and life. So, quick question. So are we looking to approve both the 3 and the 5, or one or the other?
Right, so the 3-year is only for those who already have the academy. We don't have to send them through that.
Okay.
The 5-year would be if we have to send them through an academy. So that's why there's a difference in the two.
And what is the cost difference? Like if you have to send them to the academy and you don't?
So we get reimbursed for the actual costs of the academy. We don't get reimbursed for the salary that we have to pay them to send them through.
Okay.
So Allison Burnett talked about tuition reimbursement and stuff like that for those. Unless they're sending themselves through the academy, they don't have to pay for it. We pay for the academy, and some do send themselves through. So, I don't know what that percentage is nowadays.
Okay, sorry, keep going, that'll help.
That was actually my potential suggestion would be, and I did talk to, and I noted this too, I talked to our chief in Kaukauna. They won't hire someone that hasn't been to the academy. So I see Ashwaubenon's hiring practices as actually positively inclusive. The fact that you're willing to take on someone, take a risk, make the investment in them. However, I think there's got to be a way, which is the reason we're all here today, to lessen that risk and put a little bit more skin in the game for that potential employee. I would love to see a model where we say, hey, we're not going to pay for this, but if you pay for it yourself and you work here for a certain amount of time, and you can set all the contingencies on you want on it, such as successful performance reviews, certain key performance indicators, you would qualify to have that reimbursed at the back end of your employment. And then if they leave, we wash our hands of it. They spent the money, they didn't work out here, we're not any more investment other than that time spent while they were at the academy than we would have been otherwise. I don't know how that would make us competitive in terms of hiring in our regional landscape. I don't want to pretend to know that, but I just see very little burden being put on the employee to come and try this out. I mean, I wish I could have found somebody to hire me and be like, well, maybe if I like this, I'll go to college. I didn't have that option.
I think we're pretty competitive as far as attracting candidates simply because of what we do. We pay very, very well because of all the disciplines that we do. So you have to be very skilled. I think we're competitive that way. I'm just presenting this as an option for the village to, have an option to have an out, I guess, if they decide that this isn't for them, and all that money and time that is spent on them. And I get what you're saying. The academy itself they have to apply to the academy and be accepted. If they do it on their own, they have to do their own physical, that type of thing. So I think that could work for them if they applied and were accepted for that. If we enter them that, hey, we hired them, we're going to put them through, it's a little more of a guarantee, if you know what I mean. So there is some challenges with that, but that could be an option. I don't know that Greg would want to reimburse anybody. We'd have to budget for something like that as well too. So, we can talk finances later, but I think that's an added burden on us if we're actually reimbursing them later on.
I mean, is it though? Because it means that you've gotten 5 years of an employee who's now fully trained and hopefully in that time, if they have successful performance reviews, has contributed at least in the $10,000 value by the time they reach that year.
Yeah, maybe. I guess we'd have to analyze that to see what that would actually look like. I can't do that in my head right now, but it could be. I mean, I see what you're saying.
This particular issue comes up, albeit 4 times in the last 4 or 5 years. So it's not something that we are dealing with on a monthly, if not semi-annual basis. So maybe what we can do is kind of go back and look at that. I think you made the point of kind of the carrot and the stick approach, and maybe there's an opportunity to provide incentive to stay versus punishment if you leave kind of viewpoint. And I don't know how that would look, but it would kind of achieve the same ends through a different means perspective. But if we're already paying for the academy, paying wages to go through the academy, it may be a net neutral standpoint from a cost approach as we look at it. So maybe we can kind of look at that and think about a way to provide more incentive, but yet still achieve the same ends to our goal here.
And sorry, go ahead, Tracy.
Oh, I was just going to ask, obviously, Public Safety Department is unique to a standard police department because you have to have 3 different skill bases. How many potential candidates come to you that have all 3? Is it?
I couldn't give you an exact number. I can say it's not very many.
As I say, so I think,
Yeah.
Comparing it to a traditional police department is like comparing apples and oranges to a certain degree, because the training for your department is much more, it's higher.
Right.
And I think there's very few that come into that have all 3 of those. If you have one, you're going to grab them up right away because that's a great thing to have.
Absolutely.
So I think the cost for you is going to be there in one of those 3 skill bases, regardless. And, maybe doing it more of an incentive type thing would be good, but I think that might be a little difficult to do as well, just because of the need for that training to be there as they come on board.
Yeah.
And what I was going to say is, so in a way, I don't look at this it is different, but I mean, my company still has bonus if you have a sign-on bonus or relocation. If you leave within a certain amount of time, it is expected that you paid back. Ours is 2 years, but it's a lump sum. If you leave within 2 years, you are expected, there's a prorated amount to pay back your sign-on bonus and relocation if you have relocation. So there's that. So I don't see much difference. And I can say we are also toying with the idea of putting something like this in place for our skilled laborers going into the trades, where we spend 5 years and 5 years of money putting time into them. We pay for their wages while they're at school. We pay for them while they're here, and they come out with a journeyman's card. And if they leave us after they get their journeyman's card, we are looking at or we've been toying with it for a while, and they're still doing the research at paying back their schooling, because the cost is, that's 5 years we have invested into someone that leaves who knows when, or maybe leaves us also in the middle of our apprenticeship. This is a state indentured program. So, I see it from both sides, and I know as a company, we have 100 people in our maintenance department, so that's a lot of people per year that we're putting through school, that I know the employment market has gotten to where it is. You hate to put punishments on it, and you view it more as an incentive, obviously, to keep people to stay, but you also, there's a point where there's so much money being thrown out the door that it's really only a punishment if you leave. And ultimately is what it comes down to. Maybe we could look at a different 3-year, 5-year, maybe the 5-year becomes a little less than 5 years or something like that. but I mean, I know the employment market is getting harder and harder and harder, and I am trying to figure it out myself, but I know employers are being faced to have to do things that they normally wouldn't do.
Yeah, and I think that, for us, at least in my experience, I've not had anyone question these contracts when they want to come on board with our agency. I don't know that that would be as big of a disincentive as you might think in our profession. But I think we can certainly take a look at this and see if there's maybe another avenue that we can approach. I wasn't really looking at it as to cost the village any more money. I was looking at it to protect the village, in other words. So hopefully that we can figure out something along those lines if that's the direction we need to go.
I'm assuming we'll bring this back to another meeting, would you be able to give, I know it had some, but what we're talking about, I know it's gonna vary based off of what they have, what they don't have, all of those types of certifications, but I know the one said 7,500 or something, but what is the cost that we're looking at between the 3 and the 5 year?
Well, I can tell you just going to the academy itself and wages alone is over $16,000. So we're not recouping, maybe half of what we're expending in salary alone. So I don't know that that's unfair in that regard. I mean, we're only recouping a fraction of it. It's just a little more, skin in the game, as you say, on their part to make sure that this is what they really want to do.
Okay.
And maybe it's just a matter of how we package it and communicate it to our candidates and prospective applicants that we're paying for you to go to the academy, not only for the actual education portion, but we're going to pay you a wage to attend school. And all we ask in that giving to you is more or less a commitment to us of 3 or 5 years. And if you make it that long, everything's great. If you don't, then we expect some level of reimbursement for that commitment that we gave to you. Because in theory, now in this particular most recent case, this person is in all likelihood leaving law enforcement. They will not practice in the field. But in many cases, people that go through these academies and the schooling, they'll leave the agency to go to another agency and practice that same skill set that we paid for them. And so I think it's probably just a matter of how we communicate and how we package it and how we sell it to the applicant and to the candidates as they come into the system.
I think in the business world, this type of an agreement is pretty common, because I know a number of businesses send people to get master's degrees, okay, and they pay for it. The company pays for it. But if you leave within a certain period of time, you have to pay it back. So I think this is just common in the business world. I don't see why this is any different than any other thing.
Well, and I know unless the village has changed their policy on education, when I was here, I got my master's and the village helped pay for it, but then I had to stay a number of years after that, or I had to reimburse the village. So there is something in place now similar to this. The other thing I would say, if you're going to look at this as a whole, is there any reason to put something similar to this with other employees besides just the public safety? I know public safety is probably our most expensive staff to get on board, but there's a cost for hiring maybe department heads, village administrator. Is it something to look at the the employees as a whole? I'm sure it's not even close to what it is for an officer, but if you're going to go back and look at it, maybe look at that as well. I mean, there's a neighboring community that they're looking for their 3rd public works director in probably less than a year right now. And the cost for them to keep going through that process, the advertising, the background checks, the medical, whatever they have to do, it does add up. So is it something, if you're going to look at this, to look at it overall? I don't know if that's the way to go.
I think there's a huge difference between academy training, which is a statutory minimum requirement, if I understand correctly, in order to practice as an officer or as a public safety representative, versus postgraduate education that hopefully contributes to your organization. Because I guess the trade-off for a master's degree would be, well, we're hoping that by helping this employee pay for this, they will gain new skills and new ideas that they'll bring back to our organization to benefit us. With the risk being, perhaps we're investing them and educating them to the point that they will now be attractive and be recruited by another organization. This is different. This is baseline education you must have to practice your job. Without this education, you cannot have this job. So I think this is just a cultural decision of whose responsibility is it to pay for this? And if we feel strongly that if an employee is, quote, perhaps not worth the investment, if they won't spend a certain number of years with us, then I think we need to go one of a couple directions. One being this direction, which I kind of think sends a message of we value money more than people, personally. Or do we go the direction of looking at, is it too difficult to hire into this very unique department structure we have, and do an independent cost analysis on whether or not it's easier to hire in a more segmented departmental approach?
Yeah, and let me be clear, it's not just the academy costs. The academy really only determines whether it's a 3 or 5 year contract. It's really everything else that involved, the salary, the training, the uniforms, all that stuff that goes along with it. So just so we're clear on that.
Yeah, and I would say I agree to a point so I mean, Greg may need his CPA to do his job. If he was not a CPA prior, he has to pay for how many exams, and the company could pay for that, but also make them sign an agreement saying you have to pay back the cost of your exams if you don't stay X amount of time, which I know companies do. You could also say that my job, for example, requires an education for me to get my job, but I got my education prior to applying for that job, and I paid for that education. So, but I understand there is a difference that my job requires it, where to be a police officer, that is like a state law, right? Like that's a thing that my employer requires it, but the state requires it here. So, I mean, there also are regulations that require certain people to be CPAs, where there are payback agreements if they pay for those exams. So I think we just maybe need to look at it a little further, but I do kind of think of it in that perspective of there are certain certifications or things that are required that other companies do as well. And I think, yeah. I just want to look at it further, I think.
And I will say, I think that if employees had to put themselves through the academy and pay for it, that would be more of a disincentive than this contract, in my opinion. To have to pay that money up front or on the back end, if, something were to go wrong and they weren't going to be here, they'd have to, repay a portion of it. But to have them put themselves through the academy, I think that, in my opinion, would be more of a disincentive than the contract itself.
But aren't other municipalities that won't hire you unless you've gone to an academy already placing that burden? I mean, I know it's not as extreme because there's not the multiple trainings required for the different fields within this department, but I just feel like if that's the baseline norm in regional departments, we are not setting ourselves apart. We're doing the same as everything else.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to know, how many of those of their, how many are out there. I think that's more the smaller departments that do that because of the costs. Medium, larger department, they're not doing that. They're putting people through the academy.
Do we know what Green Bay does?
They put people through the academy if they need to.
I think based on the conversation that we have a little bit of a mixed bag of thoughts as to how we would approach this. And ultimately, I think we could probably accomplish the efforts through 2 different methodologies. So we have this situation where an applicant comes in, doesn't have the required training, and we pay them to go through the training. We pay their wages as they participate in that training, and in turn, we ask for commitment from them in order to receive the full value of the investment that we made into that candidate. In turn, what you could provide also, and maybe there are options to this process. So here we're paying up front the cost for education, academy, and wages, or B, if they want to pay for it because they don't want to bind themselves to a 3 or a 5 year commitment, they can certainly pay for it themselves, and over that course of that 3 or 5 year period, then we get into a situation of reimbursement, where now the responsibility is on us to reimburse that over that period of time. Now, if they leave after a year, okay, they only get a partial reimbursement because we didn't get the full value of the investment in that employee. We kind of go back and we have kind of a hybrid approach that, depending on the interest of the employee and their ability to either pay the upfront cost of the academy on their own, or B, if they can't and they're the candidate of choice, that we're willing to do that, but we, again, want to have a commitment. And then I also think that, to a larger extent, some of these discussions on policy could be relevant for other employees within the entire organization, in particular skilled positions, mechanics, welders, things of that nature. Maybe we have a candidate of choice that does not have the technical skill or education that we would be willing to provide that opportunity for, but we would have that same commitment that we want to protect the investment that the taxpayers are making in that individual or through that individual. And by doing so, we expect a time return, if you will, from that person.
Just real quickly, if we go that route, think about, we get reimbursed for the cost of the academy if they pass it. So I don't know how that would exactly work if we're talking about reimbursing them for the academy if we don't pay it, because we wouldn't have paid it in the first place if they passed it, right? Does that make sense? So you're talking about reimbursing the cost of the academy if they go through it, but that's it. That's money we wouldn't have expended in the first place.
Do you hire anybody who is not in the academy or gone through the academy right now? Have you hired anybody?
Yes.
And I'm
Yes.
assuming there's a higher pay grade for that person as opposed to somebody who hasn't? Or is that not true?
No. If I understand you correctly, we have hired people that have not gone through the academy. We put them through the academy. Whether they have it or not, the pay rate is the same for new employees. Now, I am trying to work in a lateral language, which basically means that if you come to our agency with experience, after probation, we're going to credit you with that experience at a higher pay rate or a higher vacation rate, depending on what you have. So I am working that in the contract. So that would actually even add to our expense, if you think about that as well.
But does also help attract experienced employees, so.
Yeah, with the limited candidates that we have out there, we certainly want to make sure that we're able to attract the best quality candidates out there. This is one of those ways to do that.
Yep.
I just think on a last note for me, on the whole, I think we need to be realistic about the HR dynamics of employee longevity and how they have culturally changed and shifted dramatically with younger generations. I'm 32 years old, and since I got my master's degree, I've never stayed in a job longer than 3 years, because it's the only way to move up is to move out. And I don't think that that's a statement of disloyalty. It's just the business of this is how you move up. And I think that's a new normal. You know, we're hiring some roles in our organization, also in government, not public safety specifically. Our HR director is pretty much advised if our candidate is within a certain age range, we can only realistically expect 2 to 4 years. Even though some of these positions we're hiring for, the outgoing person was there for 20 plus. It's just a very different cultural landscape and how long people stay places. And I think it's a reality that it spreads across public and private. And I think one of the best solutions is to really focus on something that doesn't necessarily have an easy to calculate ROI, and that's workplace culture. How can you not only make yourself a place that offers exceptional insurance, competitive wages, but really stands out as a place of choice to work because of the culture you foster? I just think that's the direction to move in. And I'm certainly not the person to consult on what building that culture looks like, but there are firms out there.
You know, I certainly agree with that. I think that some of that has to, the culture certainly has a lot to play with it. I will also say that in our agency specifically, because of the disciplines that we do and because of the wages that we pay, we are one of the highest in the area because of that. So if you're talking about an employee who's been here for more than 5 years, it's really hard for them to leave because of that issue that they might have. They're going to have to take a step back to do that. So once we get past that 5-year mark, they don't really leave our agency. So I don't know that we necessarily have that issue that is going on around. I think we're a little bit different in that regard, but you're absolutely right. Culture does matter. Time off does matter. Especially with the younger generation. So those are all things that we certainly need to consider.
And so I'm 30, so really close in age, and I agree. So where I'm at, when I started 3 years ago, 40% of our workforce, which we have 500 employees, 40% was going to retire in the next 8 years. So that's half of our mill, just because that's the baby boomer generation. So now compound the new generation with not staying in the same place for over 3 to 5 years. And then also, all the retirements we're having, we are working our tail ends off right now to attract and retain employees. And I struggle because I am the younger generation, and I do agree that sometimes you do have to move out to move up. And that's unfortunate, but I think it's also because of the high number of baby boomers still in the workforce. I think that'll change over time. But I also think there is an aspect of holding the younger generation more accountable. I think we are adjusting, our ways, and there has to be a balancing act. Employees have to obviously work on culture, work on things to obviously attract, retain, and keep good employees. But there's also if we cater to everyone that leaves after 2 years, we'll never have an experienced workforce. So there's that balancing act of you have to kind of think about both. And so that's why I guess I'm not 100% against a repayment agreement or something, because there is that balancing act of, well, are we going to get more if we don't ask for more, or we don't expect more? So it doesn't mean there's a perfect science to it. There's both sides that I think we do also have to start getting to the point that we hold the younger generation more accountable to say, I don't know. I can't imagine. I have switched every 2 to 3 years, but now I've been here for 3.5, and I don't see myself leaving anytime soon. But I don't know. I'm thinking I have another 40 years of my career. To switch every 3 years scares me. So at some point, people are going to, I don't want to do it. So I don't know. That's just my point on, I do think we also need to hold some people accountable too. So there's a balancing act there.
Yeah, to be the devil's advocate, because you could say that we could be noted for training people and then they can leave. We could be noted for that. I'm saying they might take advantage of that situation too, and that's what concerns me a little bit too.
I think all of the opinions expressed here today are all 110% valid. It's just finding the right balance, which I think you've obviously heard. I agree with everything she's saying. I agree with everything, obviously, that Tracy has said and everything. It's just finding the right balance that I think we'll have to take a look at, so.
It doesn't sound like anyone on the committee is convinced yet to adopt the policies as they're proposed per se. So let us maybe kind of go back and do a little bit more research to see what other agencies are doing, and then we can provide that information to you, in particular our local agencies where we're more or less competing for the same candidates, if you will. We can kind of gather that information and then bring that back to the committee and see what that is. And it could be just a matter of maybe the 3 and 5 year timeline is too much, and maybe we're adjusting that period of time. I don't know, but let's maybe just kind of go and we can dig a little and get some more information for you to provide some comparables.
Do you want a motion to direct staff to do that, or are you okay with that one?
I'm comfortable with that one, but I guess I'm not familiar with what the normal processes are at the committee level here, so I'm comfortable with that. It is an action item, so maybe a recommendation to bring this direct staff to provide some additional information would be appropriate.
I'd make that motion.
I'll second.
We have a motion on the floor to table the item for further information. I have one comment about the agreement itself. It says terminate. And that, in my eyes, means that someone has terminated as opposed to resigning. Is that, I know it's the same word, but it doesn't mean that to me.
Termination in the HR world, I would say termination in the HR world it's a termination. I know that because I do them every single day. You either retire or you terminate. Doesn't matter if it's voluntary, involuntary. That's just how most systems phrase it. We could potentially look at termination / voluntary / involuntary termination. That might be a good little thing in front of it.
I will tell you,
term, but that's me.
I will tell you that this is attorney speak, and that's what attorneys want in there.
Yeah, I know when I process one, literally I have termination or retirement. That's the only thing to pick from, and we don't fire that like many people, so it's just a legal jargon word.
The
The
other
motion
thing-
on the floor is to
Can I add one question quick? or one thing, could you also look at if there's any other employees that you think should be included in, not this specific agreement, but something similar, like Joel was saying, maybe there's some other skilled employees that we have, whether mechanic or whatever. So maybe just think about that as you're bringing this one back again, just to see if there's any other group that we should include.
Any other discussion? Motion on the floor. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Next action item is the investment report, right?
I don't really have a lot of comments on this. This is just our investment portfolio that's just moving forward. I think overall fared pretty well through everything that happened this year. It was on the rise coming into 2020. It was moving pretty well. The expectation, obviously, with COVID, that it's a little bit lagged impact, but that it would come down a little bit. So overall on the year, we're looking at about a 2.5% rate of return for the investment. Last year was 3.27, so obviously down, but still better than all the previous years. It seems to have kind of steadied a little bit, but now with the new administration, things like that, we'll just keep an eye on it. Haven't done much activity within the two portfolios, the general fund and the utility fund, but they pretty much mirror each other. So unless you have any other questions, it's just information only.
Explain to me the investment life rate of return.
So all I've done is taken the total change in value since its inception in 2012. So over the life of 9 years, this has gone up 10.5% from where we started. We've not contributed any other dollars from its initial investment into the portfolio, so no other cash inflow was brought in. This is just building on its own merit through the investment itself.
Thank you. Any other questions on it? It's for information purposes only. Thank you, Craig. The last, any items for next agenda? You gonna bring this back again about the agreement? Okay, great. Motion to adjourn.
So move.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you.